Hello class, welcome to our mini lesson on memory aids. So I'm wondering how many of you are like me. My mind is not like a steel trap. I have to work pretty hard for everything I remember, and in fact my husband thinks I have a notoriously bad memory. We'll be watching a movie and I'll say that I don't remember it, and he'll say, we watched it 10 years ago together in a movie theater, and I have no memory of that. So let's talk about some ways that you can help your memory, and also some explanations for why certain things don't seem to stick in your memory. So there are a couple of techniques, and I've talked with you about them before, that you can use when you're trying to remember things, especially for a class like this. Mnemonics and the Mind Palace are the first two. So you've done mnemonic devices your whole life. You learned the rainbow with Roy G. Biv. You learned, if you learned music, you learned Every Good Boy Does Fine for the treble clef staff. You probably remember PEMDAS for the order of operations. There are all kinds of mnemonic devices that can help us remember some kind of a list. This is good for remembering a series of items. The method of loci, also known as the Mind Palace, is a very interesting one. Have any of you watched the BBC show Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch? I loved that show. There's an episode where Sherlock uses his Mind Palace to remember a ton of information. And here's the basic method, and you could try this one for your next exam. You visualize items to be learned by placing them in some kind of a familiar place. So imagine your room right now. I want you to kind of close your eyes and imagine your room and really, really visualize your desk and your bed and your nightstand and your lamp and your dresser and maybe a chair, a beanbag, or where your computer is, where the window is, where the closet is. Really visualize all of those things. Now take something that you need to try to remember and place each item in a location in the room. So for example, if you want to remember encoding, storage, and retrieval, that was something we talked about at the very beginning of our memory class. Encoding, storage, and retrieval. Let's place encoding on your pillow. Encoding is where we're getting the information into the mind and trying to place it in there. So place the word encoding and visualize placing that on your pillow. The next step is storage. So let's go ahead and take storage and let's put it in a storage place, maybe your closet. You should all have a closet in your bedroom. Place storage in the closet. Storage, of course, is when we've filed that information away and it's staying in our mind somewhere. And then retrieval, maybe place that in your dresser, because you go to your dresser or your chest of drawers and you pull out things, you retrieve the items that you want to wear that day. So place retrieval there. So that's an example of the Mind Palace and a good little device for remembering items for an exam. Now, there are other ways that we can do this. Let's go to elaborative rehearsal next, actually, and then we'll skip back to the next slide. We've talked about elaborative rehearsal before. This is where you're connecting information that's new to stuff that is already in your mind. This is a very, very deep leveling of encoding. So, for example, I had a student in Gen Psych some years ago who was very good at this, and her brain just automatically did this kind of thing. So when she was trying to learn the hippocampus, she imagined a hippopotamus rumbling around campus, sitting in classes and trying to learn things, because the hippocampus is involved in learning and memory. So some kind of deep visualization is elaborative rehearsal. Let's go back to this. There's automatic, effortful, and effortful processing. Automatic processing is when you encode information without effort. So when you walk into a new building, you can remember basically what that looked like, and you didn't have to try to remember that. Effortful processing is what you have to do with your classes. This is encoding intentionally and with hard work. This requires the deep processing of a mnemonic device, visualization, method of loci, things like that. Maintenance rehearsal is probably what a lot of you are doing when you're trying to study, but I will caution you that this is probably the worst thing that you can do. A lot of students do this, and all that it does is get things into short-term memory, and it's not deeply processed. Maybe it'll last long enough for you to get through an exam if the exam is soon, but it's not really deep learning. This is where have you ever done this the night before? You just read through your notes over and over and over, or you say a definition to yourself over and over and over. That's maintenance rehearsal. That's not going to help you in the long term. Instead, what you want to do is this elaborative rehearsal where you're connecting information up to information that's already in your mind. Now, I'll bet another thing that you guys do, and I have been there too, I was a college student once too, and I would do this, is massed practice. This is basically cramming. If you spend 6 hours the night before an exam studying hard for an exam, that's massed practice. But research is really clear that that's not very effective. Instead, what you want to do is distributed practice. You want to separate your study sessions. So rather than 5 hours the night before the test, 1 hour every night before the test. The wonderful thing about this is that you're allowing your brain to work for you, because when you go to sleep, your brain goes through a process called memory consolidation. And so as you sleep, your memory is working on storage, the storage portion of memory. It's working on placing everything in sort of virtual filing cabinets in your mind. I see this all the time when I watch my kids practice their instruments. They'll be practicing, and maybe it's a half an hour practice, and they're getting a little bit better at the song by the end of the practice, but the next day when they sit down at the piano again, they're far better than they were the day before. They didn't practice anymore. What they did was sleep. So, distributed practice versus massed practice. Okay, so information is organized in long-term memory. Typically what we'll try to do is we'll try to cluster items together. And our mind will just sort of naturally do that. So if you take this list and you try to remember it, I won't take the time during this little video to do it the way I would in class, but you might try it at home. You'll have my PowerPoint. This is sort of a random list of items, and yet when you start to look at it, you start to realize that it's not that random. There are categories here. So there's furniture, there's fruits, and there's transportation. And so if your mind starts to cluster all of the fruits together and all of the transportation together and all of the furniture together, you're much more likely to remember it. This is another example of how our memory works. If you spend 3 to 5 seconds reading each of the following sentences and then try to write them down, what would happen? How many of these do you think you would get? Again, I typically do this demonstration in class, but we won't do that here. But just try to imagine, just skim through that a little bit and try to think about how many do you think you would be able to write down. Pretty typically, it's somewhere around 7 to 10, maybe at most. Some students will get up to like 12 or so. But then what if I do this? What if I give you this to look at and I say write down as many sentences as you can? Do you think you would produce more? Yeah, you would. And why is that? It's because I'm giving you what's called a retrieval cue. So a brick can be used as a doorstop, and over here we have the word brick. You can see it right there, brick. So when you see brick, you'll think, oh yeah, brick can be used as a doorstop. So these are retrieval cues. So this gets us into our next idea about retrieval cues and recall and recognition. Retrieval cues are stimuli that aid in the retrieval of information that's difficult to access. So all that long list of sentences is hard to just produce, but if I give you a little retrieval cue, you can do it. This is basically the difference between a multiple choice test that gives you a little something to recognize and an essay test where you have to produce it all on your own. So recall is retrieving information without an explicit retrieval cue. This is much, much harder than recognition, where you are given a retrieval cue. So a recall test is going to be an essay test. I'll bet you don't want me to give you an essay test. I'll bet you prefer multiple choice because you have that retrieval cue. Just like with brick, that reminds you that it can be used as a doorstop. Now, another factor in our memory is something called the serial position effect. And the serial position effect tells us that we tend to remember things that are at the beginning or the end of a list better than items in the middle. So the primacy effect is where we tend to recall the first items in a list. And the recency effect is where we tend to recall the final items in a list. So if you have a list of 10 things to remember, you're going to remember 1 through 3 and 7 through 10, and you're going to forget the middle. Christina Aguilera botched the Star-Spangled Banner when she performed at the 2011 Super Bowl. Now, she recovered, and because she's a great performer, and she was able to salvage the day. But take a listen, watch the video that I'm going to link in Blackboard for you, and watch that and think about what part did she forget, and try to apply the serial position effect to that. Think about primacy effect and recency effect. Okay, so go ahead and take a look at that video in Blackboard and then explain to your dog, your mom, your friend, the mirror, your hand, the serial position effect and how that relates to Christina Aguilera. Okay, forgetting will be the next one. We'll see you then.